Sign that we're live. There we go.
Good evening. Muhammad Ali said a lot of things. About public service, he said this: service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. I thank the candidates for stepping up and offering to pay rent for your room in Palo Alto by serving on the City Council. Public service is rewarding and it is always challenging, especially in this city. It is important, though, for voters to remember that public service does not mean perfect service. It means doing the best that you can for residents and those who work here, and doing so with integrity, transparency, and compassion. I'm pleased to moderate this event. I thank Pan for organizing this important conversation. It is critical that we hear from and learn about our candidates for public office, and I applaud Pan for creating a forum where those views can be shared. So here is the format for this evening. First, each candidate will be given 1 minute to present an opening statement. We have a timekeeper who will inform them when 15 seconds remain, and a bell will ring when their minute is up. Then we will start with the questions. Candidates will have 1 minute to answer each question. And while we realize that 1 minute is a very short period of time to talk about complex issues, we want to be sure that we have a chance to hear from every one of these candidates. So candidates, when you hear the bell, please complete your sentence and stop talking. So in that way, I'm not forced to jump in and cut you off. Also note that there is no banking of time. That is, any time that you don't use in answering a question cannot be carried over to another question or to your closing statements. After opening statements, we will have a series of questions that have been prepared by Pan. Now, several candidates will answer each question before we move on to the next one, but not every candidate will be answering every question. But each candidate will be asked an equal number of questions. Now, each candidate has 2 red cards. You want to hold those up so they can see? All right, and the red card holder can use these once to question another candidate, challenge the candidate, or to respond to a question that the red card holder was not asked. Now so that's 2. You get 2 shots at it, all right? Pan's leadership has sought to create questions around issues of importance to residents across all of Palo Alto's neighborhoods. We will be exploring issues such as housing, traffic, development, and much more. To be clear, I have not written or edited any of these questions, nor have I assigned the questions to particular candidates. I am simply the messenger. As well, none of the candidates have seen the questions. After I ask the prepared questions, we will transition to questions from you, the audience. There are blank cards on your seats for your questions. And please keep your questions legible, brief, and indicate to which candidate, no more than 2, your question is directed. Our monitors will collect these cards and they will be sorted by Pan's leadership and read as time allows. We will collect your questions until 8 p.m. So there will be no direct questions from the floor. All audience questions will be submitted via the cards on your seats. It is likely that we will not have time for every written question, but we will do our best. After the audience questions, each candidate will have 1 minute for a closing remark. And this event will end promptly at 9 p.m. So, to our audience, we ask that you stay until the end of the forum. It is disruptive when people leave early. It's also a little disrespectful, especially because this forum is being telecast live. The candidates will stay after the event, so you will have a chance to talk with them further if you are so inclined. And finally, and this is critically important, we want every candidate to feel comfortable expressing her and his views and speaking frankly. To this end, please refrain from applauding, booing, or expressing any other reaction to our candidates' statements. So now let's get started with opening statements. We'll begin with the two challengers. First, Pat Boone, followed by Allison Cormack. Then we will have opening statements from the incumbents. First, Tom Du Bois, followed by Eric Filseth, and followed then by Corey Walbach.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Judge, and thank you all for having us here this evening. And I got to tell you right now, I am so happy, and this feels so good to be up here right now on this dais. It feels comfortable. I can get used to this. I'm a grassroots candidate in this campaign. I consider myself a person who is just like anyone else, a person of the people. And that's what my campaign is all about. I believe in the true sense of what democracy is, of the people, for the people. I spent 25 years as a professional TV broadcaster, and I found that that was not my true passion. My true passion was serving others and doing the best I can to represent them, and I figured government is the way to do it. I'm a newcomer to Palo Alto, but I don't believe this race is about those who are here time served. It's where your heart is. And Palo Alto adopted me when I came here, and this is my way to give back here on the City Council. And that's why I need your vote, and that's why I want to be your next councilman.
Good evening. Thank you to Palo Alto Neighborhoods for hosting this. My name is Allison Cormack. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I've lived in Palo Alto for more than 21 years. Our children went through preschool and Palo Verde and then JLS and Gunn. They're both in college now. I had the honor and the privilege of being the chair of the bond campaign for the libraries in 2008. I was also the president of the Palo Alto Library Foundation, successfully raised $4 million. And for this work, I was lucky enough to receive the Tall Tree Award in 2012. I also want to let you know a little bit about my professional background. My first job was on Capitol Hill. I worked on the United States Senate Budget Committee for 3 years. After business school, I worked at Hewlett-Packard for 7 years in finance and then sales. And then when I returned to the workforce, I worked in Google in communications and customer support. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to this evening.
So I'm Tom Du Bois, and I'm here tonight to ask for your vote for City Council. It's been a real pleasure to serve for the last 4 years. And this is a critical election. It's going to shape the city for decades to come. We need a lot of new buildings in town, police and fire, Cumberland Community Center, an animal shelter. We have major transportation challenges. We have to make decisions on our rail crossings. And we need a well-run and responsible oversight. We need a well-run city and responsible oversight by the council. So I have experience to do the job. I've had a career in management. I've been a CEO. I've worked with boards of directors, and I understand many facets of a well-run organization. So on council, I've tried to be a voice of reason. And tonight, I'd urge you to listen. As candidates, we need to share our vision, our values, our policy ideas, and we need to take legislative action that's supplemented with information. So I'd ask you to listen tonight for the vision that we each express in our answers. And I do want to thank Pan and LaDoris Cordell for hosting tonight.
Hi, I'm Eric Filseth. I've lived in downtown North since 1991. Tina and our two boys went through the whole Palo Alto school system. I worked in the semiconductor industry for about 27 years. I was a vice president at Cadence and then later CEO of a smaller company for several years. And I got involved in this in downtown North. Nielsen Buchanan is my neighbor, and I got involved with him in the parking issue and ended up running for council in 2014. And at that time, what we saw was a bit of a split between City Hall and residents, particularly around land use, and parking policies were part of that, and development and so forth. And the other was some concerns about how the city managed its money. And in the last 4 years, I think we made some progress. On land use, we put in office growth limits in place. We did retail protection. We closed some parking loopholes. Finance can still have some concerns. I think we need to do a number of things now. We need to deal with our housing, traffic, and parking challenges. I think we need to make some investments in our community, both infrastructure and amenities and services, and I think we've got some work to do on finances.
Thank you to Judge Cordell for moderating, and to the audience for coming, and to PAN for organizing. My name is Corey Wolbach. I think most of you know I'm a Palo Alto native, grew up here, moved back to Palo Alto in my early 30s. It's been my pleasure to serve for the last 4 years on the City Council with Tom, Eric, and the rest of the team. Over the last 4 years, a vision that I articulated 4 years ago, which was considered by some to be a bit crazy then, which was actually finding some balance, saying slow down on office growth, but do focus on housing and make sure we invest in our transportation options for all generations. That was something that wasn't really articulated. And I brought that to the discussion, tried to make sure that that was how we were talking about our land use vision for the future. And I'm glad to see that that is really kind of the consensus vision now. I've been happy to work with my colleagues in moving forward on making it easier to add accessory dwelling units, changing our zoning code, which we're still in the process for, to prioritize housing instead of offices. There's a lot more work to do.
All right, thank you all. We'll start with our questions, and these are questions proposed by PAN. What are the top 3 goals you want to achieve in the next 4 years on the City Council? And this question will go to all of our candidates. I'll repeat it. What are the top 3 goals you want to achieve in the next 4 years on the City Council, starting with Ms. Cormack?
Traffic is the number one thing I hear when I'm walking and knocking in every neighborhood and at all of the house parties and neighborhood events and coffees that my team has been graciously hosting. We've reached a tipping point, so I firmly believe we're going to have to do something more aggressive than we have been doing, and that's going to involve public transportation. So that's at the top of my list. The second thing on my list is definitely going to be affordable housing. We haven't built any in this city since 2011. I'm particularly concerned about the seniors in our community, and there are going to be more of them. And then the third thing, it's so hard to choose 3. I think it's a tough call between finances and infrastructure projects. I'm going to go with my personal favorite, which is Cubberley Community Center. I have seen this movie before. I've seen something dilapidated in South Palo Alto that people up here on this dais ignored, and it had a happy ending, and I'd like to see that again.
Right. Mr. Du Bois.
It's hard to pick 3. I would like to see us agree to the plans and begin construction for the Cubberley Community Center. It's a huge piece of land. It's a very important function in our city. A lot of community services there, and we'd be shared use with the school district. I'd also like to see us make a decision and begin implementation of our rail crossings, grade separations. And this is, again, something that's going to impact Palo Alto for the next 100 years. And then finally, I think we need to really look at restructuring our finances as a city. We need to start to cut back and to be able to help fund portions of our unfunded pension liability. And I think a big piece of that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later tonight, is a business tax to have commuters help and the businesses that they work for help mitigate a lot of the impacts we're seeing in terms of traffic and housing demand.
Thank you. Mr. Wolbach.
I agree it's difficult to pick 3, but I think we could say better management, better mobility, and better housing options for all generations. On better management, I think we are all aware that the senior staff in City Hall right now looks like Swiss cheese. There are so many holes. Middle management is under-trained, under-prepared. I don't want to throw any staff under the bus, but I think it's important that we work very closely with our new city manager as he takes over and takes the reins at the end of this year to ensure that we're really making sure that all of our senior positions are filled and that we're breaking down silos across departments. On better mobility, this is for all users. If you drive, or if you bike, or if you take transit, or if you walk, it should be convenient and safe to get around town. For housing, it should, and I think we are really getting to consensus on this, which is great, it should be possible for somebody of any generation to live in Palo Alto. A senior looking to downsize, somebody who grew up here, people of my generation, people of the next generation, and people working hard raising their families.
Thank you. Mr. Boone.
I think, as everyone has said, there's a lot of different topics and way beyond 3. But if you got to pick them, for me, would be not in any particular order. I believe we need to get moving on this emergency services building because the police department, which I took a tour through today, the building is practically falling apart. These are our public servants who protect us. When something goes wrong, we know they always have our back. So I believe the city needs to have the back of the emergency services here in our own town. We need to do that soon. I believe that we also need to work with businesses and actually come up with a real business registry and work up real traffic plans to solve our traffic issues here in town versus just continue to talk about it or put a Band-Aid on it. And then real affordable housing for real people who need affordable housing, not affordable housing that's $150,000 or $200,000 or $300,000. That's not affordable. We're talking real money for real people who are trying to survive every single day. That's what I want to do.
Thank you. Mr. Filseth.
Well, I think we need to do some work on our finances. The way our finances are currently structured, we're okay for the moment, but in the long run, the way we're currently structured, I believe, is unsustainable, and I think we need to make some shifts now to avoid a crisis in the future. Second is I think we need to finish the infrastructure plan, particularly the public safety building, the bike bridge, which we promised to the voters several years ago, and we need to execute on. And third, I'd like to see us find a way. You want traffic to go away, but I don't think that's realistic. I'd like to find ways that traffic doesn't get any worse than it is today. I think that's pretty important to people. Okay.
Thank you. I want to remind our audience that there are cards where you're seated, and if you have questions you want to ask of the candidates, you can pose them to no more than 2 candidates, and the monitors will pick them up, and we will stop receiving the cards at 8 p.m. All right, our next question goes to 3 individuals. They go to Mr. Filseth, Ms. Cormack, and Mr. Du Bois, and in that order. And here is the question. Of all the issues facing Palo Alto, which one concerns you the most and why?
I have to pick one, right? You know, for me, the reason I think it's we have a lot of stuff that's urgent, right? But the reason I think the financial one is the most important is because it's the longest term thing. In the long term, nearly everything we want to do is going to cost money, and we're talking decades and decades here. And if we don't pay some attention to this, then we're not going to be able to fund the services and the things we want to do in the future. And that touches pretty much everything. So I think that's the long-term, it's sort of the urgent, important kind of thing. I think long-term it's the most important because it touches everything.
I heartily agree with finances, and for a couple of reasons. One is I'm sure we'll talk more later this evening, as Councilmember Du Bois has mentioned, about potential taxes. It's important to me. I'm a fiscal conservative. My first job was on the United States Senate Budget Committee. I do remember when the debt hit $1 trillion, and it scared me. So when I look at our finances today and I think about what we have to accommodate, not just our current services, which are wonderful, not just the pensions, which will be significant in the out years, not just the rail crossings, which is an enormous project, but also things we haven't touched on yet. For example, sea level rise, how we're going to protect our entire city from this and our services. So finances for me in the long run are extremely important.
I'm going to go with transportation. We truly have horrendous problems. And I think we need to do some dramatic things. And it's not just tweaking around the corners. You know, we've had a TMA for 4 years. We've been funding it out of our general fund primarily. I think it's really time, again, that the business community step up, pay its fair share. Transportation Management Association is one of our most flexible tools to eliminate single occupancy trips. And it'll have dramatic effects on traffic on the road, on parking. And so I think we need to really find a way. We've thought that companies would volunteer. That hasn't happened, volunteer to pay into the TMA. So I think we need a business tax, and I think we need to use it for transportation, and that will have one of the biggest impacts on our city.
Thank you. The subject matter of these first 3 questions was goals and vision. So this is the 3rd question in this particular section, and it goes first to Mr. Boone and then to Mr. Walbach. Palo Alto's current population is about 67,000 people. What should it be in 2030? How will Palo Alto grow the needed infrastructure and services? Mr. Boone.
Well, I think we need to watch that. That's a very good question. I think we need to watch that tremendously, especially with growth at Stanford. I believe that we can expect probably about another maybe 10,000 more people to be here in the city over that period of time. If we can watch our growth tremendously, making sure the businesses don't expand too much, and then of course we could balloon. How do we prepare for it? We have to start getting smart as much as we possibly can, getting smart to make sure that our traffic is going to be in place, working with companies, working with neighbors, have a cooperative operation where we're talking together on solving our traffic issues, getting people out of their cars. That's one of the ways of getting the people around town. As for creating housing, we need to come up with smart housing. Just like I said, affordable housing. I don't have a problem with us having more housing. It's just that we have to have housing that people can afford, actual people can afford. So I believe that if we approve any additional housing, there has to be a higher amount of affordable housing units inside those projects. So I believe we have to just think smart.
Mr. Walbach?
So I think that Mr. Boone is right approximately with the numbers. We've already made a decision, and I think we should commit to just fulfilling that decision, not go over, but not go under. And that decision is we're going to add about 3,500 to 4,500 housing units, according to our comprehensive plan, between now and 2030. And so that might work out to about 10,000 people. As far as how to manage that, there are a couple things we need to focus on. One is the transportation impact. And I think that part of how we do that is by planning and focusing that new development, new housing, in places where it will have the least traffic impact, and to make sure that it's accompanied by strong and enforceable transportation demand management programs like we've done at the VTA Park and Ride lot, where we excluded the property from the neighboring residential permit parking area so that if residents can't fit in that building, they can't park up the neighborhood. It's also important that as we plan to focus on coordinated area plans, which I'm happy to talk more about.
Thank you. The next 4 questions concern the subject of housing. And this question is directed first to Mr. Filseth and then to Mr. Boone. Do you favor rezoning mixed use from retail and office to retail and housing?
Sure.
Done?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Mr. Boone?
I totally agree as well. I totally agree.
All right. Next question goes first to Mr. Walbach. Oh, red card. Mr. Du Bois, go right ahead.
Might as well get rid of this thing. Now, I think it's actually, so something I proposed 4 years ago when I was campaigning. It became part of the comprehensive plan. And it really attacks the issue from both the numerator and the denominator when you think about our jobs, housing, and balance. So if we can convert some of our mixed-use zoning, particularly in downtown, from retail, residential, and office, and what we've seen in projects that have come to us have been a little bit of retail on the ground floor, 3 stories of office, and then maybe 2 penthouses on top. If we can convert that into a residential and retail zone, then I think we can get a lot more housing, and we can get it downtown, near the Caltrain station.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the next question on housing. This question will go to Mr. Walbach first, then to Mr. Du Bois, and then Ms. Cormack. Why do you support or oppose restrictions on evictions without just cause and limits on annual rental rate increases? Why do you support or oppose it?
I haven't supported prohibiting those, but I have supported requiring relocation assistance. And the reason is, frankly, I want to make sure we can get something passed. If I thought that we could get it passed and it wouldn't get overturned at the ballot, I'd be a lot more open to those conversations. I think that rent stabilization in the traditional sense and just cause eviction in the traditional sense are effective tools, but I don't hear from very many Palo Altans that that is going to be popular, and I think that it would be challenged and it would be overturned. I think that it is really important that we do everything we can, everything that's politically feasible, and every policy that we can make stable to protect renters in Palo Alto. It's part of a three-legged stool approach that is my approach to dealing with the affordable housing crisis. One, we need to deal with the overall supply, as we were talking about earlier with how much housing we should add. Two, we need as many affordable units as we can get by enabling and supporting and actually voting for affordable housing projects and inclusionary. And third, the renter protections.
Mr. Du Bois.
Yeah, this has been a recent topic of discussion, and I was really deeply disappointed that the council couldn't agree to at least have a discussion on the full range of options around renter protections. I mean, to answer the question, to me, it comes down to values and first principles. It's not whether we have the votes or not. So I support just cause evictions. I think, again, we live in a very heated economy, and a lot of other cities in the Bay Area have moved forward with that. I think we have a lot of examples we can look to, study, figure out how to craft a local ordinance that would work. In terms of rental increases, what I've said, I don't have a particular percentage increase in mind, but I do think we should have some kind of limitations over extreme rental increases year over year. So, but I think the most important thing is that we have a full discussion on the topic and we really kind of vet the options.
Right. Ms. Cormack.
One of the things that's been missing from this debate so far, from my perspective, is the data. So before I make a decision on just cause evictions, I'd like to better understand how big of a problem that is in this community. So that's my answer on that one. With respect to rent control, which is rent stabilization, as the city attorney has indicated, for me, it doesn't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem for me is supply. And we talk about demand and supply and how that affects pricing. So rent control doesn't build a single new place for anyone to live. So that's why one of the many reasons I'm not supportive of it.
All right, our next question on housing goes first to Ms. Cormack and then to Mr. Walbach. Should denser housing development, such as fourplexes, be allowed in single-family residential neighborhoods? Ms. Cormack.
That's not something that I think is, that I contemplate that we would be supportive of, so no.
All right, Mr. Walbach.
No, I don't think that that's where we should be focusing new housing. I think we should be focusing it downtown, California Avenue area, potential coordinated area plans at the Stanford Research Park. We've, in our comprehensive plan, suggested that we might explore housing if Stanford's open to it at the Stanford Shopping Center. But I don't think that turning single-family neighborhoods into fourplexes is the right approach for Palo Alto. I think we decided and we've come to consensus around accessory dwelling units, which is like R1 plus a little bit. I think we should leave it there.
All right. Our final question in the housing subject area goes first to Mr. Du Bois, then to Mr. Filseth, and then Mr. Boone. Should the city have and enforce additional restrictions on Airbnbs to protect neighborhoods and housing supply? Mr. Du Bois.
Yes, this is actually something I'm quite interested in from a couple of different angles. First of all, when you see some Airbnb ads that advertise, great apartment in a quiet neighborhood next to a park, you realize that we're opening up hotels right in the middle of R1 neighborhoods. I've studied Airbnb ordinances with other cities. I think somebody occasionally renting out a room is not a problem. What's a problem are, where an entire building is rented and there are 12 bunk beds put in and it's basically a hotel. The other thing is it's actually a large amount of housing inventory that is rented constantly that instead could be rented on a monthly basis and become housing. And so I think it's kind of low-hanging fruit, and it's really something that we should take a look at.
All right, thank you. Mr. Filseth.
Am I next? Okay. So I agree completely on the hotel issue. I think that's a code violation, and we should stop it. People shouldn't be running what are essentially hotels in the middle of neighborhoods. We have zoning for that. Relative to the issue of long-term versus short-term rentals, I wish I had a better picture of how much of that there is in town. I can't tell whether it's that big an impact or that big an impact. And so I wish I knew that, and I think we ought to figure it out.
All right, thank you, Mr. Boone.
I pretty much concur with it. I believe that, I understand that this is not a great economy for a lot of people. A lot of people have to survive in a lot of ways, and Airbnb is a way for a lot of people to open up their homes to make a few dollars to make ends meet. So I know how important that is, but from the aspect of your neighbors who are around you, beyond you making that extra dollar, I think there has to be more thought into that. So I think as of right now, we have to put as many restrictions on having those in neighborhoods, because neighborhoods need to be neighborhoods, and you can't have a neighborhood, a good quality of life, with an Airbnb sitting right in the middle of it.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll move to our next topic, which is development. And the first question, there are 3 questions in this area. The first question will go to Ms. Cormack and Mr. Du Bois. Do you support or oppose retaining the 350,000 square foot cap on downtown commercial development? Ms. Cormack.
Just point of clarification, that's not the one-year cap.
That's just the question. I have
Okay.
nothing else to
All right.
add to it. Go ahead.
Okay, yes, I support the permanent cap in the comp plan.
All right. And Mr. Du Bois?
Yeah, I believe the 350,000 cap downtown was removed. And I think that was a mistake. We have a lot of caps, but the one downtown, it's really, again, a question, what do we need, housing or more office? And I think by having a cap, we actually enable the conditions for housing projects to become more attractive. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Our next question will go first to Mr. Filseth, then Mr. Boone, Mr. Wolbach, and then Ms. Cormack. Palo Alto charges $35 per square foot on office and R&D development as below-market rate housing impact fees, while the maximum justifiable rate is $264. Would you support increasing the fee? Mr. Filseth.
Yes, I would. Essentially, what the Nexus report study says is that for each new square foot of office and R&D space, it creates demand for $264 worth of affordable housing. And so the $35 accounts for about 13% of the total demand. The other 80% is socialized to the community. I think that office developers who produce that kind of thing should pick up more of the cost of the affordable housing generated by their projects. So the history was the 2016 council set that fee in response to the Nexus study at $60. At that time, there was a motion by Councilmember Wolbach actually to reduce it to 40. That failed. But the next year, in 2017, the council reduced it to the current $35. Now, a month ago, the County of Santa Clara did an assessment on the Stanford expansion and proposed $68. So I think our fee should be at least $68, which would be 25% of the demand, and could be higher than that.
Mr. Boone?
I believe that 68 is a good start. I think it should go up even much higher than that. I believe that there might be some debate where some may feel like those fees will impact if a developer wants to develop affordable housing, but I don't agree with that. I think that whoever wants to develop in this town, they understand property is high, and you've got to pay for it, and the fees are high, and you have to pay for it. It's the part of doing business here in Palo Alto. So I'm for that fee, if not a little bit higher.
Mr. Wolbach?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I supported it at 60, and then we heard from the beneficiaries of the program that we were out of our minds. I know some people have said they've heard from some people somewhere something different, but what we heard in public, what we heard from the beneficiaries, groups like Palo Alto Housing, was that setting it at 60 was going to undermine their ability to raise funds, or for the city's ability to raise funds, which we could then use to help with affordable housing. So when the people who are meant to benefit from the program say that we've overstepped, I listen. That was one where I changed my mind. Stanford's different because they own their land in perpetuity. They're not going anywhere. However, look, I'm always willing to revisit the issue if we get more information, and if the housing developers, the people who actually give us affordable housing in Palo Alto, say that we can justify that we won't hurt them by going higher, I'm very happy to charge more to office developers.
Ms. Cormack? Yes, red card.
How much time do I have on a red card?
Mr. Filseth, you have 1 minute.
I have 1 minute. So at the current $35 level, in the last 12 months, the city collected $1.5 million in fees from office development for affordable housing, okay? By the city's capital expenses, with a $1.5 million a year revenue stream, you can fund $10 to $15 million of capital expenses. At $500,000 a unit, that funding, the difference between 35 and 60 or 68, amounts to approximately 20 affordable housing units. So if we don't re-raise that fee from 35 to 60 or $68, it's going to cost the city 20 affordable housing units. I don't think that's a good trade-off.
Right, Ms. Cormack?
Is that a question?
He was allowed to give an answer because he wasn't called on. All right? Ms. Cormack?
Thank you, Judge Cordell. I want to pick up on what Councilmember Walbach said at the end. If we have new information, things have changed in the past couple years. I am open to looking at being higher. It is not clear to me that I have enough information to pick what the exact right number is. Definitely, worth having some conversations with people in the planning department on that. I am open to it being higher. It's not clear to me, though, yet exactly what the number should be.
Thank you. All right, our final question in the development section goes to Mr. Du Bois, then to Mr. Boone, then Mr. Filseth, and then Mr. Walbach. To what extent can or should Palo Alto accommodate all businesses that want to locate here? Mr. Du Bois.
So I think my position on commercial growth has been pretty clear. And again, I think it impacts the tremendous pressures we have for housing. The Citizens Initiative came to the council. I think either I or Councilmember Filseth made a motion to put it on the ballot initially, and that was voted down. And then it had to come back to us a second time when we adopted it. We are currently in our comp plan, we've agreed to maintain our historical rate of commercial growth. The other issue that we haven't really gotten into yet is the intensity of use in those buildings. A lot of buildings in the research park used to be labs with fairly unintensive use. And as kind of the modern workforce has shifted, we see much denser occupancy. So I don't see a huge demand to build additional office space at this time.
All right, Mr. Boone.
I totally agree. I think not only I heard chuckles on that when I questioned, not only should that not happen, we need to have a much more policing on growth of businesses here in Palo Alto, but also we need to police on what's happening inside the buildings. Many of the companies that I'm hearing are packing people in, so that's also impacting our traffic, impacting our roads, and impacting our neighborhoods quite a bit. So we need to have better enforcement on these companies that are here right now. Now, I'm not a hater of companies. I love them, and I think that we can all work together in the same town. But I believe that we need to have better management and better enforcement of how the companies are packing in their employees. And that's why I say we need to have a business registry, and that will help us have a business tax, and that can lead on to greater things for us.
All right, Mr. Filseth.
You ask this question in most of the country, and they look at you like you're from Mars, right? So I think at this point in time, so narrowly, I think it's hard to make a case that Palo Alto residents are suffering from not having enough office space and jobs in this town, at least at this point in time, right? In a more general sense, I believe that it's pretty clear that the way the economic engine of Silicon Valley works is it piles up immense wealth in some sectors and doesn't fully cover its housing and transportation costs, and actually by quite a bit. And those costs get socialized to communities in the forms of either, things like Measure A and Measure B, where we go back in sales taxes and bridge tolls and so forth, which are orders of magnitude less than it really takes, or they get dumped on communities in terms of, pressure on lower income workers and so forth, right? The costs of housing and transportation are vastly higher in the Mid-Peninsula than they are in Diridon Station, and I think the rush to Diridon Station is a good thing for the region, right? Theoretically, if you could cover all the costs, including externalities, you might have a case here in the peninsula.
Mr. Walbach.
I think we've actually started to make a real change, along with starting to really talk about adding a little bit more housing in Palo Alto. We've done a lot in the last couple of years to ramp down on office growth. I don't think it's our job at this point to facilitate business growth in Palo Alto substantially. The problems that we face today and the lack of affordable housing, workers competing for the limited housing supply, the traffic problems, the parking problems that spill into neighborhoods, all of it stems to our jobs housing imbalance. We added jobs for decades and we didn't add the housing or the transportation to keep up. So I think it's important that we continue to limit growth. I think it's important that we keep our, and maybe even strengthen our restriction on chain stores in certain places, continue to protect ground floor retail. We're also starting to have stronger and more enforceable transportation demand management programs that are accompanying new developments. I think those are important. And actually really agree with Councilmember Du Bois's comments earlier. The TMA, the Transportation Management Association, is a huge opportunity, and we need to force businesses to participate.
Thank you. I want to remind our audience again that if you have questions for our candidates, you just fill out a card. You have about 20 minutes left because we will not accept your questions after 8 p.m. And you should list on your card to whom you want the question directed and no more than 2 candidates. The next subject area is quality of life. I have 2 questions. The first one will go to Mr. Wolbach, then Mr. Filseth, and then Mr. Du Bois. What have you done to make residents' quality of life better in Palo Alto? Mr. Wolbach.
So I think that the most important quality of life challenge that we have right now is parking. And so I've been really happy to support expanding our residential permit parking program into a lot of new neighborhoods. Now, it's a double-edged sword, and I knew that before we did it. And frankly, the management of it has been a disaster. We've lost our transportation chief recently, and the contractor that the city has employed to roll that out, frankly, has done a terrible job. And so we're trying to get somebody new on board and have them implement some changes. But at the end of the day, people who live in the neighborhoods surrounding University and Cal Ave can park on their street, and they weren't really able to do that a couple years ago. So I think that that's the biggest change. Airplane noise, we all know that there's a limit to what we can do at the city level, but we are working hard and we are fighting hard to have a united message to the federal government on that.
Before we go to Mr. Filseth, I've been asked to ask each of the candidates to please speak up into the mic because people are not able to hear everything you're saying. So please make an extra effort to speak into the microphone. Okay, directly in. All right, Mr. Filseth.
Well, I was one of the leaders of the whole RPP initiative even before I got on council. I think the Professorville neighborhood had screamed for 10 years that they were getting inundated with commercial vehicles. It was a long battle. There were a couple of times we nearly failed on council because there was significant opposition from stakeholders who liked having free parking in residential neighborhoods, but that so far has moved forward. I think we still have a few hundred cars to get out of some of the neighborhoods, but I think we have made things better, and I think we can make them a little better still.
Mr. Du Bois.
So I'm going to go with parking first. So I wrote the memo to actually expand our residential parking permit into Evergreen Park and Southgate. I've been a pretty fierce advocate for continuing to reduce the amount of business permits we issue in our downtown RPP. I think the other thing that's happened since I've been on council is we've issued much fewer exceptions for development projects. And exceptions in Palo Alto are worth millions of dollars to developers. I think they started to get the message, and they started coming to us with much more compliant projects. And then the third thing is we basically restarted and completed the comp plan in 3 years. We got a dedicated group of citizens to work on it. They worked on every single section, came back to us, and we maintained a lot of the things in it, particularly statements about the importance of neighborhoods and in protecting neighborhoods, and not favoring, I guess, business over neighborhoods.
Thank you. And our second question in quality of, we have a red card from Ms. Cormack. Right ahead.
I'd like to answer that question also.
Right ahead.
I I think as many of you know, if you lived here in the early 2000s, libraries were a contentious issue. In fact, we had library wars, and when I stepped forward to lead the bond, it was our third try, and we'd had 2 significant failures. So what I'm proud of is having brought all of our libraries into the 21st century with the work of so many people who are willing to support it. And I want to let you know that that was difficult. Many people didn't believe that we could do it. But I firmly believe that I've made Palo Alto a better place for everyone who lives here.
All right. Our second question in quality of life goes to Mr. Boone and to Ms. Cormack. What would you do to make residents' quality of life better in Palo Alto? Mr. Boone.
Well, there's a lot of ways of doing that, but I think number one, listening to residents. Letting them know that they're part of this game as well. It's not just a governing body on city council that pretty much tells you this is how it's going to be and that's how it is. I think that residents need to know that you're in this game too. We're all in this city. So I believe that helps tremendously in helping with quality of life. When someone can feel as though they have a voice, when someone can feel that they're part of something, when someone can feel as though this is their town too, then they will have a better understanding that they will have much more richness in this community. So the better quality of life, or the best quality of life that I can offer if I'm able to sit in one of these seats on this dais, is listen to people more and let you know your voices are heard and actually give you the action you deserve.
Ms. Cormack?
2 things. The first would be transportation and traffic. I live on Ross Road, and the city spent more than $2 million on that. I would have loved to see that go to a bus shuttle system that is accessible for everyone of all ages. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be Cubberley. So rebuilding Cubberley would give us the chance to forge connections in this community between the young and the old, between the city and the schools. I cannot, I've said it before, but this needs to be done, and it will be a wonderful thing for all of us. And as I've also said here, it will last long after anyone is elected, and I look forward to that happening.
All right. Our next subject area is traffic. There are 2 questions. The first I pose to Mr. Walbach and Ms. Cormack. Should all new development projects provide full parking to reduce the impact on surrounding neighborhoods? Mr. Walbach.
There are 2 nuances to consider here. One is how we define full, and the second is where it's located. If a new development says, we think we can get away with less parking than you normally require, if there's a way we can force them to prove it, I'm happy to let them prove it. And that's where enforceable transportation ban management with teeth, with penalties, is important. And that's where, again, planning it like we did it with the VTA lot so that it was excluded from the residential permit area is important. So I think there are opportunities there, but we have to make sure we have some enforcement with some teeth. And the second is where it's located. One of the things that we do now that makes it hard to add housing in the places where we want it, like right on University Avenue, is it's tough to put parking, put a parking lot underground right on a building on University Ave. So if they wanted to pool resources and put a garage next door to them or across the street for their property, I'm fine with that.
All right. Ms. Cormack.
As I said in my response to this in the neighborhoods questionnaire, I'm in the spirit of innovation. I'm absolutely willing to consider it and would have voted for the parking light option, but it's important to me that we get data, right? So we measure beforehand and we measure afterward. We get a lot of people saying it works other places, it could work here. We get people saying it can't work here. Let's test it, let's see what the answer is, and then we can go on from there.
All right. Our second question in the area of traffic goes first to Mr. Filseth, then Mr. Du Bois, and then Mr. Boone. At every city-sponsored rail separation summit, the overwhelming majority of residents voted for tunneling or trenching as the preferred solution. How will you represent this consistent voice of the people, especially given that many of these people are more expert on this issue than city staff? Mr. Filseth.
We live in a great community, right? Right. So the problem with trenching and tunneling is the expense. So to actually do an end-to-end tunnel or trench in the city is going to cost $3 or $4 billion. And that's significantly higher than the anticipated financial resources we're going to have to do it. So I think the challenge in the city is to come as close to that as possible, given the realities of our financial circumstances. And whether that means, trenching part of the tracks in South Palo Alto or something equivalent to that. I think what the city needs to do is come as close as possible to the intent and spirit of that with something that can actually be paid for. And that's the real challenge.
Mr. Du Bois.
Yes, I've been on the rail committee for 3 of my 4 years. I've learned quite a bit about rail. I definitely support a South Palo Alto trench. Again, Palo Alto and the peninsula are kind of an economic powerhouse for the entire country. So I think we need to get creative about our financing. It's not something that Palo Alto by itself should have to fund in its entirety. I also think we need better community engagement as we go through this process. And a year and a half ago, I made a motion to create an empowered citizens committee to work on this, similar to what we did on the comp plan. That did not pass narrowly. And then just recently, we did form a citizens group, but they're not really empowered. So I'm concerned that it's a very complex issue, and when you have people show up to a single meeting, it's very hard to make progress in a lot of these complex trade-offs. So I would still like to come back and revisit that and see if we can't have a more empowered citizens group involved in the process.
Thank you. Mr. Boone.
I agree. A tunnel obviously is a lot of money. We really don't have the cash for that. So I believe that possibly a trench or maybe raising the rails in some areas may be one possibility there. But I believe that this issue is not just a Palo Alto issue. I believe this is something that we need to look at regionally for the entire area that the Caltrain rails exist. I believe that this is something where we all need to talk together, different municipalities, different towns, different locations. We have to work on this together versus individually, because this train is going up and down the peninsula, and we just can't say that our part's going to be perfect. We got to make sure all of it's going to be perfect, and that's the way we can work on it the best way. As for getting money, I think this is where a business tax would go in place, but I think we also need to look at federal dollars and also state dollars. We have to be creative in our funding for this, but I believe that this can happen. As a matter of fact, I know this will happen.
Red card from Mr. Walbach.
As chair of the Rail Committee this year, I figure I should probably weigh in on this one too. The challenges are really threefold. Councilmember Phillips, Eric, you pointed out one of them, which is the expense. The other two are engineering complexities and regulatory complexities, basically getting permission from Caltrain, from Union Pacific. I think all of these are surmountable, and it's going to be tough. But I think we can do it. So I voted against the effort by at least one colleague to try and remove the trenches and tunnels from our planning process. I thought it was important that we leave them on the table. And the more we learn about, for instance, the South Palo Alto Trench, the more it looks like it actually might be a really good option, and it might be feasible. And it's important that we continue to do what I've done and what others have done too, which is reach out to Caltrain, work more closely with our legislators, work more closely with our lobbyists, so that we can achieve success on the engineering, the regulatory, and the cost sides of this.
All right. The next area to discuss is transparency. There are two questions, and they will go to all of the candidates. So the first question is, are you committed to reestablishing the town hall meetings with neighborhoods, and how many should be held per year? Mr. Walbach.
Yeah, so this is something that I actually campaigned on. I early on wrote the memo, the colleagues' memo, with others to bring this forward. I think I was the lead author on that colleagues' memo to establish a neighborhood town hall program. You looked at the city of Mountain View and their program, where over a 2-year cycle, they have, I think, 7 town halls where just about every city department is represented, and people know well in advance when and where their neighborhood's town hall is going to be. We adopted something that was a little less ambitious in Palo Alto. It was tried as a pilot the first year, and then the mayors the last couple of years and the city manager, I think, just didn't feel that it was a priority, and it got sidelined, which has been a point of, to put it gently, immense frustration. I think that having neighborhood town halls that people know about, that they can come to let city staff know about the issues in their neighborhood, not just to hear city talk at them, is really important. And I'm really committed to making sure they go forward.
Mr. Filseth.
Yeah, I'm sorry we don't do more of these as well. I think the city does a number of different kinds of outreach things, but very few of these, and recently the ones we've done have been in response to sort of some significant urgent issue like Ross Road. So I think once a quarter is probably tractable, right? I don't think you do once a month. There was a while they were doing a couple a year. I don't think that was quite enough.
Ms. Cormack.
Yes, I support it, and I actually think it should be monthly. This is something I've been discussing repeatedly, and I'm going to use the rail issue as an example. Most people in Palo Alto don't yet comprehend the problem, let alone the solutions, let alone, the process. So I've already said, and I look forward, if I'm elected, to doing this, being in my own neighborhood every month on the week that we are off. Right? There's the fourth week usually, and hoping that it would be the kind of thing that other council members would do as well. Short presentation about what's coming up next month, what are the big projects we're working on, and then opportunity for real discussion. Nice if city staff can come, that'd be great, but I actually think it's the responsibility of council. I think it would have helped with a lot of things that have gone poorly in the past few years.
Mr. Du Bois.
Yeah, absolutely. I was on policy and services, and we helped craft the initial town hall ordinance. I do think at least once a quarter is a reasonable number. 2 years ago, when the development majority came to council, we literally just stopped, and it hasn't been a priority. I think it needs to be a priority. So I would welcome restarting the town halls, and I would also think we should look at perhaps officially recognizing some of our neighborhoods and our neighborhood associations and having a more formal relationship between the city. And we have some very active neighborhood associations. They do a lot of great things. And I really think the city and those associations should work together.
Thank you. Mr. Boone.
Well, I believe there should be a set-up schedule for town halls, but I don't believe that should be the only reason why council members need to be in your neighborhoods and talk to you. I don't think there should be any policy that's set for that. There should always be an open line of communication between a city council member and yourself. It shouldn't have to be a stature of, okay, this month we're going to have the town hall. No, that dialogue should have been going on all along, way beyond that town hall. I think that's what needs to happen more in our town, is that we need to talk more. We need to be a little bit more connected. We don't need a policy or procedure or a date or a calendar or anything that says that this is the day that we have to be together. We should be knocking on each other's doors, always talking, always involved with each other, always having that dialogue going on. And as a council member, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I've done 25 years of being a reporter, talking to people, interviewing people, and as a council member, I love to talk, but most importantly, I love to listen.
Right. Our second question and final one on transparency goes to all of our candidates. Recent surveys have found Palo Altans have a higher level of cynicism and distrust in their city government than those in other cities. What would you do to restore that trust? Mr. Boone.
Well, I think people need to feel that they're, kind of the same thing I've been saying, people need to feel that you're listening to them, and you actually do need to be listening to them. And you just need to be honest with them, straightforward. Let them know you got their back. We're all in this together. This is not a us against them or us against you. This is all of us together. I believe that's how you do it. You just continue to build trust as much as you possibly can. And not everybody's going to have goodwill towards you, but that's where you can work a little harder to build those walls even more. I stress on creating some policy or dialogue or whatever. I think this comes from the heart, and that's what my campaign's all about. It's a campaign of compassion. It's connecting with one person, every single person at a time. I think that's how we become an even better city, is that we are working together because we are one. We are one Palo Alto.
Mr. Du Bois.
So I've been troubled by seeing these surveys with declining trust in our local government. I think we need to maintain, the highest ethical bars we can. It's not a question of legality. It's really a question of appearances. I've recused myself on many issues where I didn't feel I had a conflict, but just even the appearance of it was a reason to recuse. You know, I think we've had some issues, again, with some of our appointments to our boards and commissions. We've had issues with campaign finance violations. And I think one of the biggest ones is we have made some huge, somewhat rash decisions at literally the 11th hour, 11 p.m. And it's just, it's not the way to engage the public. It's not transparent. We've taken some huge votes when the majority of Palo Altans are asleep.
Mr. Wolbach.
Yeah, so this is part of why I mentioned management early on as a key priority. It's important that we deliver on our commitments, right? When the city makes a commitment and we don't deliver, of course, we lose the trust of the community. And that's why I've been so frustrated the last couple of years. I am cautiously optimistic that with new management at the top of the city that will start at the end of this year and start of next year, that we'll be able to break down the silos between departments and fill those gaps so that the staff will be available to do the implementation. Ultimately, we're a legislative body. We don't do the implementation work. That's up to staff. It's important that we work closely with staff to make sure that that's happening. I just think that's the number one thing. Secondly, being more in strengthening our communication with citizens, making sure that our city website is comprehensible, making sure that we're doing the town halls. Things like that are also really important. And I'm out of time.
Mr. Filseth.
Right, so I think we're having the right discussion here. I do think you need to sort of look at two aspects of that. One is city staff and the other is city council, right? And I think the city staff, as Councilmember Wolbach said, I think needs to get better what I think of as the nuts and bolts of government. So accurate planning, efficient execution, and proper alignment to community expectations. I think that the new city manager we hired, who starts in December, is sort of that kind of person. So I'm hopeful that that's going to help. As far as the council is concerned, I pretty much agree with everything that Councilmember Du Bois said. I think that I actually don't think that the communication with the public is the problem. I think the council has made some undisciplined moves. I think some of these issues and ethical clouds over some of our commissioners have added to the problem. I think the council needs to do a more consistent job at this kind of stuff than it has.
Ms. Cormack.
I have 3 points to make on this, and the first I actually think is directed to the people who usually sit here on Monday nights. Those of you who are careful observers of this council will see that trust has been eroded, and that's going to need to be rebuilt for the leadership to function correctly. So that, I think, is problem one. Problem two, talking about the staff, I don't think people who work here get up every morning thinking about how they can do a bad job for us. I really don't believe that. But I do believe that there's a better way for us to help them, to engage with them. One of the options, we talked about finances earlier, is contemplating a participatory budget platform where residents can get involved and help us make decisions so that the 9 or 7 people up here are not doing this on their own. It's a version of the committees that Councilmember Du Bois was talking about. The third thing is communication, which I could go on about all night, but I only have 15 seconds left. This is an opportunity, and it's really not rocket science. We can do so much better.
All right. And we're now going to move to our next section, which is finances, of which there are 2 questions. The first question will go to Ms. Cormack and Mr. Boone. Do you favor or oppose improvements to the business registry, including being tied to use and occupancy permits and residential parking permits? Ms. Cormack.
Yes, I absolutely favor improvements. I think you would be hard-pressed to find someone in this community who doesn't favor improvements, given the status of the data. With respect to tying it to residential parking permits, I'm not entirely clear about how that would be a connection. Certainly open to learning more. Yeah.
Mr. Boone.
I think, first of all, we need to have an effective business registry. That would be a good start, getting businesses to be part of this and police them and enforce them to be part of this registry. I think that's going to be very important. And I think from there, then working with the businesses to make sure that our parking is in place. I don't think that's a quick, easy answer to dole out right now. I think that's going to have to be something that we work out. But I think it all starts with a real business registry so we know exactly what we're dealing with. And businesses can fess up and be honest about how many people are they packing in these buildings.
All right. Our second question in finances goes to Mr. Wolbach, Mr. Filseth, and then Mr. Du Bois. Do you support some form of employee headcount tax? Why or why not? Mr. Wolbach.
Yeah, I do. We almost did it in 2016. I was really close to supporting in 2016. I felt that the committee that was set up to study transportation funding focused too solely on that and didn't do their homework. And when we go out to pitch a sales tax, or sorry, to pitch any tax, I think we need to show that we've done our homework. I said then that I wanted to see it as a possibility for 2018. I guess maybe leadership or the finance committee dropped the ball, but that didn't come to us this year. I thought that was unfortunate. The way I would suggest structuring it would be exempt smaller employers, probably do graduated based on the number of employees, and use that funding to support transportation programs. You could use this as a carrot and stick to funnel businesses to participate directly in our Transportation Management Association, where you could say, you know, whatever you donate directly to the TMA, you can have it as a deduction from your tax, but either way, you're going to be paying.
Mr. Filseth.
Let me make 3 points on that, so yes. And the first is, first of all, I think it's going to be essential for some of the projects we got to do, rail separation and so forth, so I think that needs to happen. It's going to need to happen. The second is that more generally, I continue to believe that the economic engine of the valley doesn't adequately fund its housing and transportation costs. It piles up wealth in one place and doesn't spend enough on its expenses. And I think a business tax, which is generally where the wealth goes, right, needs to get rebalanced a little bit. So I think it's consistent with that. The third is that if you look at the revenues in the city over time, the fastest growing source of revenue in the city's general fund has been residential property taxes. And so over time, the share of city operations paid for by residents has shifted, has increased. And so I think business taxes will tend to set that the other way. Now, the TOT tax, which is a business tax, does some of that.
Mr. Du Bois.
Yeah, so we are one of the few cities in California that doesn't have a business tax. So in 2016, we actually had a unanimous vote, including you, to form a stakeholder group to study the business tax so we'd be ready in 2018. And then after the election in 2017, the new council, including Councilmember Wolbach, reversed the vote, and we didn't form that stakeholder group, which was going to include businesses and residents to figure out the form of a tax. And so here we were in 2018. We hadn't formed a stakeholder group, so we said we weren't ready to put it on the ballot this year. So in 2019, I think we need to reverse that decision. We need to form a group to really analyze the different forms of tax. Again, I think we want to look at a fair tax that looks at some of our largest employers. And in terms of what it funds, I think the question is going to be, is it a nominal tax or a significant tax? I don't think there should be an option to opt out. Once the TMA is funded, we're going to continue to have traffic impacts, and I believe this business tax should be going to other transportation issues.
All right, we have a red card from Ms. Cormack.
I want to add my voice on this topic because it's an important one. It's important to me and should be to all of us that we match sources and uses of funds. You've heard a lot of discussion tonight about the impact on traffic from people who are coming here to work. It seems appropriate to me that we have a business tax tied to transportation, whether or not it's general or specific is details we can get to. Headcount is a logical first place to consider, certainly based on the discussion we've had tonight and how other communities are approaching it. But this group, whenever it is formed, should also be looking at revenue-based, square footage-based, and evaluating, what is the level at which we'd exempt small business. So this is a very important topic that'll be coming forward. We will require more information before we make a decision, but it does seem appropriate.
All right, any other red cards? Okay, we're going to move to our Last question. This is question number 19. And it's a question that will be posed to all of the candidates. And this then will go to our audience questions. And this is in retail. What specific steps would you propose to attract and retain neighborhood serving retail and services? Mr. Boone.
Well, I think neighborhood services for retail are very important, but we also have to look at services like doctor services, medical services that aren't in a lot of neighborhoods, and people have to go very far away to get to their medical services. I think those are some of the issues that we need to look at even more than some of the stores out there. Retail is fine. And making sure that the neighborhoods are actually neighborhoods. That's going to be something that we have to make sure we keep in place. I think those are the things that we need to look at first before we look at an additional retail aspect to it. I know that obviously that was one of the questions, but I believe that some of the real services like medical services or services that people need beyond retail is going to be probably more important, in my opinion, than that.
All right, Ms. Cormack.
So we're all experiencing the change from buying things to services, from retail shifting from where you purchase things to where you purchase a service. And the city, frankly, has had difficulty mandating profitable businesses in certain locations, including, as we all know, grocery stores. So I share the belief that it would be wonderful to have more local retail, walkable neighborhoods, but it is quite difficult for the city to mandate that. This is an area where some sort of partnership, collaboration, potentially with Chamber of Commerce and other groups to help us understand what are the problems, how can we address them, and look at maybe concentrating a little bit in some of the smaller shopping center areas. I'm thinking Midtown, Charleston Center, which have been successful. Make sure we don't have any issues there that would lead to us losing additional tenants and perhaps adding some.
Mr. Du Bois.
Yeah, well, the nature of retail has certainly been changing, but if you Wall Street Journal, retail experiences are booming. And so I think one thing we could do is we could look at an economic development position. Los Gatos does that. They have an amazing assortment of retailers downtown. And so I think we could be a little more proactive in looking for experiences, services. Do agree about the small medical should be included. And then I think we need to continue to protect retail ground floor. When retail has to compete with office rents, it loses. And the retail protection ordinance has been critical to slowing the exodus of locally serving retail in town. It's one of the things I'm proud of that we accomplished in the last 4 years.
Mr. Filseth.
So I think Allison made a good point that the umbrella needs to keep an eye on local serving services as well as just retail. When you talk to these groups, one of the things that they tend to be most concerned about is parking, and both their employee and their customer parking. And I think if we're going to enter into an environment in which parking is a scarce resource, which is both happening and also part of the transportation intent, right? Then I think we need to manage it, and we need to make sure that we're not hurting our retail or local serving retail and services with parking. So they need to be part of the priority equation. In fact, I think neighborhoods ought to be cured first, local serving retail and services ought to get it second, and everybody else ought to get it after that. That's easy to say. It's actually very difficult to do. It's impossible to do with our current IT system. Hopefully, as we overhaul that, this will get more tractable.
All right, Mr. Wolbach.
It'll probably save me some time if I first say I agree with everything that Eric just said, and point out, I also say I very much agree with Tom's point about having an economic development staff. We used to, we don't now, we need one again, at least one person. Again, we need to keep up our retail preservation ordinance. We need to keep up and maybe strengthen, as I said before, our chain limitations, or the limits on the number of chain stores in certain areas, where we have it at Cal Ave now. I think we could take a closer look at our definitions about personal services. I think, as we've discussed earlier, zoning for ground floor retail with multiple floors of housing above is a great way to preserve the two things we need most of in this town, which are small businesses and housing. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I think with coordinated area planning, where you can plan to have some local retail, you can embed requirements, and you can embed some housing so that they'd have customers, is a great thing we can do as well. This is a multifaceted problem, requires a multifaceted response.
All right. All right, we now go to our questions from the audience, and as a reminder, Ms. Cormack has used both of her red cards. Mr. Boone still has 2, and Mr. Du Bois, Filseth, and Walbach each have 1 left. All right, first audience question goes to Mr. Walbach and Mr. Filseth. And we'll start with Mr. Walbach. You'll give your answer, and then Filseth. Please state your position on prioritizing new housing over new hotels. Does Palo Alto really need more hotel rooms? Mr. Walbach.
It's simple. We need housing before we need new hotels. I wasn't crazy about the new Marriotts going on San Antonio. I was happy that we were able to require, and I led the charge to require that they provide funding to mitigate traffic on San Antonio. We've all seen what's happening downtown with the President Hotel, which is an apartment building. It's currently housing. We need more places like that provide housing, not more hotels. And yeah, I think it's a simple answer. End of the day, I'll save the rest of my time.
All right. Mr. Filseth?
I don't think it's a one or the other kind of thing. I think we need to execute the comp plan on housing. The comp plan has housing targets, and I think we need to proceed down that path. I'm kind of agnostic on hotels, right? And the comp plan doesn't have any specific targets for hotels in it, so as long as we execute the comp plan on other things, I'm not sure hotels really enter into the equation.
All right. Next question goes to Mr. Du Bois. Why doesn't Palo Alto have a zero net loss of housing law? When a fourplex is replaced by a single-family home, why aren't those development rights transferred to another lot?
I think it's a interesting idea and something we need to look at. I think, the loss of housing and the replacement of older housing, which is just naturally more affordable, and replacing it with new construction, which is super expensive, really contributes to a lot of the problem. I think one of the things we could do is really have a target for what % of our housing inventory we would like to be below market rate housing. Other cities have done this quite successfully, and I think it lets you keep track of that inventory and really, not just add a few units here and there, but track your progress over a number of years that you're actually increasing the below market rate inventory stock. I mean, we did add 70 units last year when Stanford opened up their affordable housing in El Camino, but it's not enough, and we lose much more year to year.
All right. Next question goes to Ms. Cormack, and then Mr. Walbach will answer. Can you suggest a concrete solution to house the homeless? Ms. Cormack.
I wish I could. I'm sure any of us wish we could come up with, the one answer that would make life better for people who are living outside or on the streets. I'm proud to live in Palo Alto, where, the Opportunity Center has been built. There's a lot of discussion beginning about how we can more humanely treat the people who are living in RVs on El Camino and elsewhere. I don't think I personally can solve a problem that is bedeviling, this entire state. But I am committed to working on it, and I believe that Life Moves and other organizations are doing an exceptional job. Hotel de Zinc, our churches that work each month. We can do better, and I look forward to helping.
All right. And
There's been recent reporting and studies about an alarming increase in youth homelessness in our area. People who are young adults or even teenagers who are homeless because of the economic imbalance that we have in this area, because of this deep supply and demand imbalance. So fundamentally, we need to keep working on the housing crisis, right? We need to make sure that we have moderate job growth as opposed to the crazy fast job growth that, even though we've moderated in Palo Alto, has expanded in the region. And again, regionally, every city needs to do its part to add at least a little more housing, especially those cities that in the past have added a lot of jobs. I'm a little bit worried that although Mountain View is adding a lot more housing than we're planning, they're also adding a lot more jobs than we're planning. So I haven't run the final ratio numbers, but they might not be doing a better job than us in their balance going forward. We need another opportunity center. Thank you for mentioning that. And we also do need a safe and sanitary place for people who are living in RVs.
all right. Next question goes to Mr. Filseth and Mr. Du Bois. What can you do to improve code enforcement in our town? As a resident, I've been told that a neighbor had clearly violated code, but the city could not enforce it. Mr. Filseth.
Well, for a long time, the primary code enforcement was bandwidth, right? And I'm sorry to see we staffed up and code enforcement got better, and then we've lost one of the principal people, so I'm really sorry to see that guy go, right? And I think the answer is we got to staff it.
All right. And Mr. Du Bois?
Yeah, number one, we do need to staff it, and it was too bad we lost that employee. We do have a code enforcement audit coming up, and again, this is, the council basically looks at the audit plan and prioritizes various audits. And so I think, as following that audit or during that audit, it's really up to council to make it a priority. I think it's becoming more of a priority, and I think staff is getting that message. But if you don't enforce your ordinances, they're not worth that much. So I think code enforcement is critical.
All right, next question goes to, bear with me a second here. All right, next question goes to Mr. Filseth and Ms. Cormack. Is there a reason you see that would justify reactivating use of planned community zoning? Mr. Filseth and then Ms. Cormack.
I wouldn't rule out permanently PCs. There may be places for them. The reason I don't like them is a couple of reasons. One, fundamentally it involves negotiating something with a developer, and in my experience and observation, the city gets outgunned by these guys every single time, right? By the professionals. In general, a PC is a one-off kind of thing. It says, I'm going to do a special purpose zoning just for this, and I'm going to negotiate a special thing. And I think we ought to try to avoid those. I think we ought to have codes, and I think we ought to stick to our codes. And so I think too often PCs are sort of a sloppy way of dealing with something that really ought to be done under a code. So in general, I'd like to see us have codes and not do a lot of one-offs for all these reasons. Could we never do one again? Not necessarily.
All right. Ms. Cormack?
I second everything the Vice Mayor said for the same reasons. They have not been used effectively in recent memory, and everyone has a right to be upset about that, me among them. But that doesn't mean there isn't something in the future. Can I personally foresee what that is? No, don't have a crystal ball. But if you think about everything that's changed in the past 12 years in our world and in our community, and you anticipate the end of the comprehensive plan 12 years from now, I think it's possible that there's a scenario under which we would have a wonderful benefit. I definitely would like to emphasize the need to do a better job negotiating. In many respects, we do hold the cards because we would be approving it. So, agreed.
Thank you. This is a question for Mr. Wolbach. You are running on a platform as an advocate for housing, but your pro-development, anti-housing voting record says otherwise. Please tell us, based on the following vote, how you can justify your statement. You voted and seconded Fine's motion to reduce office and R&D impact fees for affordable housing from 60 square feet to $60 per square foot to $35 per square foot.
So I think we addressed this earlier. I do very strongly reject the premise, but as far as the specific question, look, what we heard as a council from the people who actually do affordable housing, which is not us, it's developers, whether for-profit with inclusionary or nonprofit doing solely affordable units. They told us, if you raise the fees that high, you won't end up getting any affordable housing. I know Councilmember Filseth, Vice Mayor Filseth said earlier that he thought that we'd lost affordable housing, but what we heard from the people who actually do this, the professionals, the experts, was that if we went to 60, we would get almost zero. I'd rather get something than nothing.
Next question goes to Mr. Boone and Ms. Cormack. What would you, red card, I'm sorry, Mr. Du Bois, go right ahead.
So this whole question of impact fees, we had a very valid nexus study. City spent money, we hired experts, they went out and studied impact fees, various regions, and they came back with this report. I did talk to some San Jose-based affordable housing developers. They supported, they thought the Nexus report was very well done. It's true the Palo Alto Housing was hesitant. They were one developer. Based on the Nexus report, we passed the higher rate. And when it came back for a second reading, the majority lowered that rate. So again, I think there's enough studies out there that we can raise the impact fees. And I think we need to do it if we want to really build below market rate housing. The whole issue is financing and money, and the impact fees we charge today are not enough to create housing.
All right, the next question goes to Mr. Boone and Ms. Cormack. What would you bring to the city council that the incumbents might not offer? Mr. Boone.
Sorry, guys. It's like I said all along, one thing that I bring is I bring my ears, and I bring my heart, and I bring my compassion, and I bring my hard work, and I bring my dedication, and I bring my honesty and my transparency, and I bring you to every meeting. We're all in this together. This is our town, and we got to work together to make it our town for us. Not for any other entities, not for any other particular special interests, but for all of us. So I believe that I bring that different type of newness that I believe the city council is lacking right now, a little bit more energy that it needs. And you know what? Maybe it's about time. Maybe it's about time, not necessarily a person who can be a little loud, because I know I can talk loud, but someone who actually has more passion in their heart for you. That's what I bring.
Ms. Cormack?
Two things. One, I would bring my experience, and the second thing would be, frankly, my identity. I am the person up here who has experience helping our community resolve a contentious issue and get to an answer and actually solve a problem. So that is the first thing that I would bring. And I think we have contentious issues, and I think I could be a person to help us resolve them. That's the first thing. And the second is, frankly, my identity. I may be the only woman in this race, but there are women running all over this country because we want to see a government that represents the people.
All right,
I'll do a card on that one.
All right. Mr. Boone?
I agree with you, Ms. Cormack. I totally agree with you, 100%, ma'am. I think there needs to be more Allisons, and there needs to be enough Pat Boones out there. There's a lot in politics that there's lacking diversity, and we need it. We need it. It is mandatory. It's not a suggestion. It's not just to say, okay, Allison and I, we're not like these guys, and these guys are cool. But you know what? You need that diversity. We need it. It's mandatory. It's how we are going to move together as a community, but as a nation. We already see the problems that are happening on the national level and even the state level. Let's fix our own house. And how we do it? Bringing new faces and diversity to this council. That's how we change the future of Palo Alto.
Next question goes to Mr. Filseth and Mr. Walbach. Regarding confidence in government, a member of one of Palo Alto's committees, PTC, is reported to have changed residential zoning rules to their own benefit. What should be the role of City Council in addressing corruption inside the city? Mr. Filseth and then Mr. Walbach.
Well, as I said last night, I think maybe the two most important qualities you need in people on council and also in the commissions, which are nominally part of the council, are ethics and integrity and judgment. Right? I guess that's three. Right? That individual had already served a couple of years on the Planning and Transportation Commission, and every single council member knew exactly what they were getting with him when he came up for reinstatement. And 5 members of the council chose to reinstate him anyway, okay? I was not one of them. You were. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Walbach. And I think, Mr. Philseth, will you please clarify, when you said you were, to whom were you referring?
Mr. Wolbach.
All right, Mr. Wolbach, your response to the question.
And to Mr. Filseth. First to that, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, I at least did not realize what was going on with that particular project at the time that we reinstated that member to the Planning Commission. In light of that, in my growing understanding of what happened with that situation, I not only would have a much more difficult time reinstating them, as I mentioned last night, I think resignation might be necessary, and I want to be careful how we talk about this, but I've definitely been talking to, I think, the right people to gather the information we need to move forward effectively. But that behavior was not acceptable. I think we all agree about that.
Right. Next question goes to Mr. Du Bois and Mr. Filseth. El Camino Real is zoned CN and CS, which are intended for ground floor retail, but some sites are used for office rentals and others proposed for residential. Will you require enforcement of improper office uses and resist ground floor housing? Mr. Du Bois, then Mr. Filseth.
So this is kind of related to the code enforcement question we got earlier. And part of it, one of the arguments we hear is that we can't support ground floor retail all over town. But just like you need affordable housing, I believe you need affordable retail. And so we have AAA retail, and we can have Class B retail. So generally, I think we need to enforce the ground floor retail. We should not be allowing offices to pose as retail. One of the enforcement issues we had was a headquarters for a restaurant where they had like a single table in their office. That's just fun and games. In terms of residential, I not for necessarily market rate housing. I do think we might want to evaluate it for below market rate housing. It's been a discussion we've had about the ground floor. Could it support retail? Could it be a community center? I think it should be something that's public.
All right, Mr. Filseth.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm pretty much with Councilmember Du Bois on this. I think you got to understand that every applicant, every commercial space applicant, office space applicant comes to us and says, here's the 10 reasons why this location's no good for retail, okay, and you need to let me put a tech company there. So I think we really need to resist that, including along the El Camino corridor. And I agree, it's a code enforcement issue. As far as residential is concerned, I wouldn't do it for market rate housing. For below market rate housing, my inclination is that the first thing we ought to do, because most of these things ultimately involve money. I mean, the big challenge with below market rate housing is who's going to pay for it and how do you do that, and can you do it with zoning or relaxing parking specs? And my first inclination on all this kind of stuff is let's find the money to pay for it, and that's why I'm so adamant about raising commercial development fees in order to pay for that, because we need the money to pay for it, right? Never's a hard word. I think it ought to be one of the last things we do. Right?
Thank you. Next question is for Corey Wolbach and Mr. Filseth. Regarding plane noise, how aggressive should the city be in challenging the FAA? Is it time for litigation? Mr. Wolbach.
To answer the first part, how aggressive should we be? Very. And I think we've been doing that, but we can always do more. Really, we lean on the community on this one, and we lean on our staff. And we work with our colleagues and our counterparts in the region, and we've even gone a couple times to DC to talk to the FAA directly, which has been, let's just say, frustrating. As far as whether it's time for litigation, it's important. Like it's important for especially a sitting council member, but even people who might be on the council, to be very careful how much we say about a specific litigation strategy, because we don't want to tip our hand that would undermine us later. But I think we've been very clear that every option is on the table. We are putting together and it's taken too long, but we are putting together a fast-track process. We are trying to keep a closer eye on what's happening at the FAA so we can respond when needed. We've talked to our lawyers quite a bit about this, and we'll continue to, because like I said before, every option is on the table. This is a critical issue for quality of life.
right. All right, more questions, and I want folks to know here I am not changing the order of any of the questions. I'm just taking them as they've been handed to me. Next one is for Corey, Mr. Walbach. One of the PAN candidate questions, I'm sorry, did you? No, you don't. Mr. Filseth.
Was I supposed to answer that one?
I apologize for that. Go right ahead, Mr. Filseth.
yeah, I
This is
think-
about plain noise.
Yeah, no, I think Councilmember Wolbach's right on all counts here. I think, in fact, if you want to hear a good story about the FAA, ask him about his meeting with them sometime, right? The real uplifting stuff. I think, this is going to be a long haul, okay? And we got to stick to it. And there are a basket of tools that we can use. None of them are great. Litigation is one of them. I think we need to be as aggressive on litigation as we should be, but not more so, and that's part of the challenge here. The city, we are institutionalizing a process a fast-track process to make a decision on litigation as the FAA produces new flight path changes, and I think that's important. But again, I think this is going to be a long haul.
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Walbach. One of the PAN candidate questions asked about zoning impacts on neighborhood services, local doctors and therapists. What is your position on Measure F, which would regulate such providers?
Oh, I'm very strongly against Measure F. It's bad legislation. I mean, look, we can all agree that, yeah, healthcare costs in America are kind of crazy high, right up there with rents, whether you're residential or retail. But this is not the solution to that problem. This is a really complex problem. Trying to solve it at the city level first, I think, is the wrong approach. And secondly, it creates a huge administrative burden for the city. Third, a lot of small medical providers, as the questioner mentioned, would probably be very severely impacted by this. And frankly, yeah, it's just a bad policy. So I'm strongly against it.
All right, thank you. Next question goes to Ms. Cormack and Mr. Boone. What decision-making process do you use when issues come before the council? Ms. Cormack?
That's a hypothetical. So those of you who haven't seen the packets in actual life, they can be this big. The good news is that I love to read. That's why I worked on the library. So I promise you that I am a careful reader. I do ask questions. I ask clarifying questions. I would do that in advance as requested by the staff so that that's helpful. For me, I very much like to hear from both sides of an issue, and I am a careful listener. Sometimes people will feel, and they've said this to me during the campaign, I need you to take a stand. And I'm a cautious person by nature, as I've said before, and I want to do my research before I make a decision. It is important to me to read and listen and decide things in a pretty straightforward way. I'm a pretty no-nonsense person. Any of you in the audience or listening at home who know me know that's true.
Mr. Boone?
Well, first, I think that when you come to a council meeting as a council member, you need to not have your decision already made. So I think that you need to know that an issue takes time, and you're going to have to give it a lot of yours to make sure you understand it clearly and that you hear people and you hear both sides of every issue. And there's a lot more thought into it. It's a lot more research into it, especially if it's something more complex. If it's something a little bit more easier, then maybe that can be worked out a lot quicker. But I think the easier thing or the more clearer thing of answering this question is when it comes to the decision-making process is to hold off before you make one. Don't make one too early because there's a lot more details you need to know before you say yes or no.
All right, this next question is for Mr. Du Bois and Mr. Walbach. The city has a 100-acre deficit in providing park space for the number of residents who live here. Do you have a plan to provide the missing park space, such as the Fry's site? Mr. Du Bois.
100 acres is a lot in Palo Alto. So I do think we need to continue to add park space. We need to look for it where we can. We just completed a pretty great Parks and Rec master plan, and one of the funding priorities is to get that funded. There's some land available. There's a AT&T piece of land in Bulware Park in Ventura. I do think the Fry's plan needs to include park and green space. And I think as we look at future developments in the city, we need to continue to add. And I would like to see kind of reasonably sized parks. I think sometimes we get proposals for little pocket parks. Those are nice to have, but what we really need are spaces where people can really be in nature and enjoy a park.
Mr. Wilbach.
Yeah, great question. The Fry site absolutely should include some park space. And I try not to push my own vision at the start of a coordinated area plan because it really is about the community. But let's be honest, we all hope that there's a park included in the Fry site or the North Ventura coordinated area plan, or that we expand or expand the existing park nearby. Other places where we can see redevelopment coming and are hopefully done through coordinated area plans, CPI, like Fry's, CPI is going to be leaving. What's going to happen with that site? We've talked for a while about, looking at Mountain View, they're redesigning all of their North Bayshore area. We should be talking about redesigning at least substantial portions of the Stanford Research Park, not just CPI, but other areas as well. Stanford's finally open to that. That's in our comprehensive plan to look at doing some more stuff in the Stanford Research Park, including housing, but it needs to come with park space. I would also add, again, Stanford Shopping Center as, I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Next question goes to Mr. Boone and Mr. Du Bois. Do you support installing bike lanes on El Camino Real? Why or why not?
I'm sorry, ma'am.
ahead, Mr. Boone.
Okay. I think that's a possibility. I think that we need to look out for our bikers as well as we need to look out for our cars on El Camino Real. That's a tight little road, as we know. We also have an issue with the campers and RVs that are there as well. But I believe that we do have to understand there's a bike society out there, and it's pretty big and it's growing quite often. And many people drive cars and ride bikes as well. So I believe that that is a possibility. I think that there may be other areas that we may be able to look at bike lanes. That's one of the ways of getting people out of their cars. So there are some options there. As for exactly what it will look like, how we can utilize it, I think it needs to be more into that we need to talk more about it. We need to study a little bit more, but I think that is a good direction to go into because biking gets people out of their cars.
All right, Mr. Du Bois.
I generally agree with things Mr. Boone says. I'm going to respectfully disagree on this one. I'd prefer to see separated bike paths where possible. And I think we really need to focus on our major arterials, and I think El Camino is one of those, as places to maximize vehicle flow. So we do have some existing bike paths that parallel El Camino. We keep talking about traffic. And at some point, I think we need, again, to consider some roads as primarily vehicular roads, other roads as bike boulevards, and then we can have mixed roads with a separated bike path. But I'm concerned that as we continue to kind of reduce our major arterials, we are basically just pushing traffic onto local streets into neighborhoods. And so my preference would be, not to add bikes directly onto El Camino.
All right. Next question goes to Mr. Filseth and Mr. Du Bois. Why does Palo Alto have to grow? Why can't we be more like Atherton? They don't welcome retail nor feel obligated to build housing. Mr. Filseth.
Right. You're asking the two guys that ran in 2014 this, right? So I would split briefly, split it into commercial, the commercial and office / R&D versus residential and so forth. And I think it's hard to make a case that Palo Alto needs a whole lot more office R&D space at this time, as we talked. As far as residential, I believe that most people in Palo Alto, not everybody, but most people would like to see a little more housing in town. Okay. I'm aware there are some that don't. I'm aware there are some people that would like to see a lot more housing in town. I'm also aware that most people sort of like our low-rise, medium-density suburban character. And there is inherent potential for conflict between those two things. And I think it's our job as government to walk that line, and that's what we need to do.
All right. Mr. Du Bois.
The diversity of Palo Alto is really one of the things that attracted me here. I didn't want to live in Atherton. But I think it's a question of growing at a reasonable rate and a balanced rate. So what's sustainable? So, nobody up here is saying that we should have no growth. But the question is, how do we grow and how do we do it in a balanced way? I think the schools in Palo Alto are one of our biggest assets. I've been endorsed by the entire school board. And so I think when we look at growth, we need to make sure we don't overwhelm our parks, our schools, and that we just do it in a way that the community can absorb. And so again, I think it's all about what's a reasonable balance of land uses.
All right. This question is for Mr. Filseth. North Palo Alto residents appear to have succeeded in their quest to close the Churchill and Palo Alto crossings. Assuming that South Palo Alto residents won't be similarly successful, how about using the money saved in the north on a tunnel below the East Meadow and Charleston crossings in the south?
Well, I think it's likely that the bulk of the effort on construction for rail separation is going to focus on the South Palo Alto, because I think, frankly, the problem is bigger there. I mean, it's not that there's not a problem in the north, but I think the problem is bigger there. And I think that what's likely to emerge from this process is, in fact, going to weight it in that direction, right? But there's a lot more to be seen here.
Right. We have a question that really kind of breaks the rule because you're only supposed to address it to two candidates. I'm going to allow it because it only asks for a yes or no. So this will be to all of the candidates, and we'll just start from the end where Mr. Wolbach is and just go right down, all right? Yes or no, should the tax paid on Stanford's commercial properties count as some of its contribution to the schools? And if you don't want to answer it, it's fine, but it's a yes or no.
No, but it's a tricky question.
Mr. Du Bois?
Yeah, no, I think it needs to come from the Stanford residential properties.
Ms. Cormack?
No, but it's a tricky question.
Mr. Filseth?
Can you repeat it again so I make sure I understood it?
Should the tax paid on Stanford's commercial properties count as some of its contribution to the schools?
No.
And Mr. Boone?
I'm going to go with everyone else no on this one.
All right.
They need to pay.
Yeah.
All right. This next question is addressed to three. I'm going to allow it because we're a little ahead of schedule. So to Ms. Cormack, Mr. Du Bois, and Mr. Wolbach. Do you accept campaign contributions from developers and realtors? Why or why not? Ms. Cormack?
I've accepted campaign contributions from anyone in Palo Alto who's been interested in supporting me. Those of you who keep careful track will note there is a retired developer who's given me a donation, which I was delighted to accept, since one of his organizations is Palo Alto Commons, a senior assisted living facility for which I and many families in this community are grateful. I think there's at least one realtor who's a young mom who loves Mitchell Park Library with her child. And I believe there's a friend of mine from business school who works for a company that is involved at Town and Country.
Just down the road.
All right. Yes, Mr. Du Bois?
Yeah, no, I'm not taking money knowingly from any developers. I think it goes back to that issue of the public trust. Again, we make a lot of decisions that relate to land use, and they're worth millions of dollars. And you can see it in terms of the campaign financing, just the rate that it's escalated in the last couple of years. I really do think we should look at campaign finance limits. It's kind of ironic. I'm sitting between the two candidates who are kind of on pace to break records. We still have some fundraising time left. But I just think money in politics is corrosive, and it would be great if we just had campaign finance limits.
Mr. Wolbach?
Yeah, so first, no, I do not take contributions from developers. I made that clear 4 years ago, and it's true again this time. Last time, I'm fine with taking contributions from realtors. I think that the relationship between realtors and the city council is very different than the relationship between developers and the city council. You know, like if Lydia wanted to contribute to my campaign, I'd be happy to accept a donation. But I think it's really important that we send a message to developers that you know, when they come and bring projects to the city, that however we make our decision, it won't be influenced by that. In 2014, I also set an individual cap of $500 per donor. I did that before other people said what their cap was, and I saw several people taking $2,000, $3,000 donations. So I've followed suit now, and I'm willing to take those slightly larger donations. I think the scale of donations we saw in 2016 was crazy. I tried to bring forward campaign finance reform. My co-authors backed out. I look forward to trying again after this election.
Right. This is a question for Mr. Boone. Should we provide mental health and sanitary services to the homeless as part of the solution to solving the problem?
I thought I was going to have a chance to answer that last question, but well, you know what? Can I use my red card
Yes,
on that
you
last
can.
question before I get to this question?
Yes, you can.
I think that it's good that candidates say they don't take donations from developers and corporations, but the thing is that a lot of residents that I talk to feel they do. And if they don't feel that they do take that money from there, because of obviously you have to be very transparent, they feel that that's in their best interests. And that's worse. That's worse. You don't take a dollar from them, but you do care about them and you do have their best interests at heart. What type of candidate is that, and what type of council member is that? We're supposed to be the council member for you, the residents, the neighbors, the people that live here, to bring your quality of life to whole. And of course, we love our businesses, but that needs to be secondary. The people that are here and live here are very important. And let me say, because I have 15 seconds, we have not talked about Hotel President and how the residents there have less than a month, or a little over a month, to find a new place to live. And I don't believe the city council has done enough for those people.
Right,
Now I'll take your question, ma'am.
All right, and the question, should we provide mental health and sanitary services to the homeless as part of the solution to solving the problem?
Yes. We have to figure out something to do with the homeless in the area. It's kind of a double-edged sword. We're fortunate that it's not something as large as San Francisco, like the Tenderloin going on here, but we do have an issue here. We do have people that need help, and they may not have another way of doing it. So we have to step in as government, but we also have to step in as neighbors. We also have to be in this together. And this is where we can work with businesses and build that line share, build that friendship, that bridge with them, and we can figure out a way to solve something. So I think that's where the funding can come in place. That's where programs can come in place. It's going to be after something that we have to work together on this.
All right. Next question is going to go to the three incumbents. So this will go to Mr. Filseth, Mr. Woolbach, and then Mr. Du Bois. Many residents, including me, this is the writer, not me, many residents, including me, believe the developers wag the dog at City Hall. Is this true? And why do you answer as you do? Mr. Filseth.
Less than they did 4 years ago or 6 years ago. I think, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think it got some more scrutiny. I think we made it harder to get exemptions. I think there was a little bit of a change in culture. Wag the dog. Is there influence? Yes, there's influence, right? How much is it? How long is a piece of string? Less than several years ago.
850 right now. Okay, I think they do. Got it. All right.
I would go further and just say no. It was true several years ago, arguably, before we got on council. I think that we've sent a strong message repeatedly. There have been some pretty controversial votes we've taken together that the development community was not happy about, and I stand by those votes. Oh, was that my time? It just as one example, something we ended up, I think all three of us voted for in the end, VTA Park and Ride Lot. A developer brought forward a proposal that was very rich in jobs and had almost no housing, and we said, and I was happy to lead the charge, and I think we all kind of sent the same message. We said, that's not what we're looking for in Palo Alto. We're not looking for to make our jobs housing imbalance worse. We scared that developer off. Another one got an option and brought back what we said we thought reflected what the community wanted. I think that's what we're doing. We've done it with specific projects like that. We've done it with our comprehensive plan, and we've done it by slashing our expected office growth between now and 2030.
Mr. Du Bois.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something we need to remain vigilant about. And again, there's big money in this for developers. It's their full-time job. They work staff. They lean on staff. We're part-time council members. But I think I've made a difference. I think all of us up here on council have made a difference. We really have not allowed many exceptions in the last 4 years, where before that there were a lot of exceptions, variances. We put a moratorium on PC zoning where some of the most egregious things were happening. And, and I think, again, developers kind of got the message and they stopped asking for those exceptions. I think if they start to see them get issued again, the doors will open again. So it's just something you really need to stay on top of, and it's important who's on council to make sure that happens.
Thank you. That's the last of the questions we can have from the audience, and we got through all but 5. So we now go to closing statements from each of the candidates. You each have 1 minute, starting with Ms. Cormack.
Before I wrap up, I want to add 2 things. One is an additional answer to my response about how I make decisions. One of the important things I learned in a training program last year for women running for office is to think about the people who are not at the table. And frequently, council is heavily influenced by people who come. And certainly, it's great that people come, but there are often many people who are unable to come and attend and stay for hours to speak for 3 minutes. So I wanted to add that. I also wanted to clarify something. Councilmember Du Bois indicated that I might be on track to break a fundraising record, and I assure you that's not true. People spent far more than $100,000 in the last election. My budget, which I'm happy to share with you publicly, is $65,000. I've raised $63,000 as of today. I have solved a contentious issue for this community. We do have other contentious issues. It would be my pleasure to serve you, and I ask for your vote.
All right.
Yeah, I also don't plan on breaking any fundraising records or coming
Mr. Du
close to what
Bois?
happened. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, we're going with Mr. Du Bois.
So I hope you heard a distinct vision from each of us tonight. I've evolved over the 4 years in office, but my values have been constant. They've been my guiding principles. And I think it's critical for you as voters to be able to rely on a candidate and that what they say on the campaign trail is what they do in office. That's what you get with me. I do what I say, and I say what I do. I'm proud of my voting record over these last 4 years. I voted for nearly every housing policy that came to council. I pushed to raise money and set targets for BMR housing. I've advanced renter protections, limited office growth, worked to push commuter cars out of neighborhoods, advocated for more community involvement in our rail discussions, supported the environment, clean energy, recycled water, the Bay Delta Plan. I pushed for more money for our nonprofits and our seniors. I see the public schools as one of our most valuable assets, and I'm proud that I'm endorsed by the entire school board. I lead on our fiber optics network, which was advancing to a business plan stage.
All right, thank you.
So please support me. Thank you.
Mr. Walbach.
First, I apologize for jumping the gun on the last one, but yes, I also don't plan on breaking any of the fundraising records or coming close to what happened in 2016, which was frankly obscene. Back on message, I've been endorsed by the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, Supervisor Joe Simidian, and a lot of other people. You can learn more about my positions on my website or by reading the PAN questionnaire. You can see more of my endorsements also on my website at CoreyWolbach.com. I do ask for your vote and ask for your support. I also agree with what Tom said. It's important that we stand by our values and we stand by what we say we're going to do. And when I campaigned in 2014, I said we should slow down office development, focus on housing and transportation. I've supported a whole range of policies to do that, and I'm glad and proud of the work that we've done collectively as a city in pursuit of that more healthy, balanced approach to land use. I've also led on and joined others in raising the minimum wage and making sure that people in our community are protected regardless of differences.
Mr. Boone.
I invite everyone to go to my website, boonecalifornia.com, to learn more about my pledge to the voters and learn more about my vision and how I feel on all the issues. I use my closing statement by saying that how I began in this evening, saying that this is a grassroots campaign. I'm the only person up here who definitely will not break any financing goal records. I have $610 still in my campaign budget right now, and I'm darn proud of that. Most of my campaign donations are about $10. I've got a few people that donated $250, but that's about it. And I'm proud of that. This is a campaign from the heart, a campaign from the people, because I believe in true democracy. I don't have any endorsements from any political people or any political organizations or groups or any other people. You know why? Because I have no strings attached. It's about time you get that type of government because you deserve that type of government. You need something new. As a line from Barack Obama from 2008, this is the time we've been waiting for. Our time is now for change.
Mr. Filseth.
Yeah, thanks. So, so there's a little left brain, right brain stuff on this kind of thing. But you know, I want to be clear. For me, all this starts and ends in Palo Alto. So I do not have my eye on the next higher political office. And when this is all over, I'm going to go home and be just a regular resident. And so you got to have sort of the resident side of the brain and the candidate side of the brain when you do this stuff. As a resident, I'm personally planning on the 3 people that I think are the wisest, most competent, most sensible, most responsible people who've got the best judgment, even if I don't necessarily agree with every one of their policy positions, right? I'm planning on being a resident long after my term expires, and I want the best and most talented, most responsible City Hall we can get. As a candidate, I've learned a lot. I think that'll help me continue to get more effective in the second term, and my God, it took me years to learn all the pension stuff. I've got some good things done that I'm proud of, some of which weren't easy, and my priorities have been consistently what I said they'd be. I haven't said one thing and done another, or the reciprocal.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming and listening to us tonight and for caring about Palo Alto.
Thank you. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" Tonight, you heard from the candidates for the Palo Alto City Council and what they intend to do for others. They've made their cases, and with just a month until Election Day, it's up to voters to decide who among these individuals will provide the best public service to those who live and work in Palo Alto. Bottom line, the future of our city is in the hands of you, the voters. Be informed, be thoughtful, then vote. Thank you all.
I just want to say a special word of thanks to Judge LaDoris Cordell for moderating this evening. And I love the level of civic discourse and civility up on the dais. Congratulations to all. And just in closing, I just want to thank the audience. You have been fabulous. We had quite a number of people watching online, I've been told. So it was fabulous that we were able to stream this live. So thank you again, LaDoris. To the Media Center staff in the booth, to city staff, I want to thank Sherry and the people with the cards, Annette and Mary and Maggie. Thank you so much for making that happen. And then also, don't forget that the Media Center is your local cable access station. It's a nonprofit right here in South Palo Alto and makes all kinds of wonderful things happen. If you're watching a government meeting, you're watching cable access TV. Okay, and the candidates will be sticking around for a few minutes. Please do not assault them, and thank them for their time. All right, good night, everybody. Thanks so much.